Hello everyone and welcome back. In the last few lessons we have been implementing our authentication reducer function step by step from scratch, from first principles, so that we are sure to understand everything that is going on. We have now removed this reducer from our application completely, and we are going to see how can we write it in a much faster way using NgRx Schematics. We're going to use schematics to generate much of the code that we have just written by hand. Also notice that we were adding here the reducer directly in the reducer definition file that we have defined here in our reducers folder, our index.ts file. These are the reducers of our root application module. So ideally we don't want to add here dependencies to our authentication module. This is especially important for lazy loaded modules such as, for example, the courses module that we have here. This module is being lazy loaded here. Only when the router hits here the courses path, only then we are going to load all the code related to the courses module. So how can we define then reducers for things such as loading the courses or loading the lessons if we cannot add anything here in our reducer index file? So this new command that we are about to execute to generate some of the code is going to help us with that too. Let's go ahead and review the command together. We are going to do an ng generate. We are going to generate a reducer file that is going to handle the reduction of multiple actions. We are going to call it the of reducer file. We have set flat to false because we don't want the reducer function to be created in a separate directory. And we want to link it to this feature module of our application, the authentication feature module. Let's have a look at the feature module right now inside the off folder. As we can see, there is no reference to NgRx at all. Before we were adding all the NgRx configuration at the level of the root module, but the authentication actions and reducers are clearly linked to this module. So let's see what this command does. We're going to execute it and we're going to see that a couple of things have occurred. Inside here the authentication folder, we now have here a couple of new files. We have here a reducer file and we have a reducer spec. We can also see here that the authentication module file has been modified. So here we have here a new entry where we are essentially configuring here the reducers that are specific to this module only. We can see here that the state for this feature module is going to be added here in the off property of the application state. Let's now have a look here at the index module. As we can see, this has remained unchanged. This is normal. All the configuration is linked to the module directly, making it easy to make it lazy loaded in the future. And we're going to have a look here at the new reducer file that was scaffolded. If we jump into it to the reducer function, we are going to see that this file is indeed very similar to what we defined before by hand. We have here an initial definition of the authentication state. We are going to rename this variable. We have here a definition for the initial authentication state. Let's go ahead and rename also this variable. And we have here a reducer function. In order for us to better understand what is going on, let's go ahead and rename it also to authentication reducer. So as we can see, the structure of this function is identical to what we had before. Let's now quickly fill in here the definition of the authentication state. Like we did before, this is going to have here a couple of properties, the logged in boolean flag and the user profile. The initial state is also going to be filled in just like we did before manually. We are going to specify here the boolean flag logged in to false, and we are going to leave the user profile undefined. We now are going to define exactly what type of action our reducer is going to handle, and for that we are going to be using this type that we are defining here. So this type is going to contain all the possible actions for authentication. It's going to be either the login or the logout action. This is known as a TypeScript union type. So we are going to take this union type here and we are going to use it in place of this type annotation. This will help us to write here our reducer functions because the action can only be one of the possible authentication actions. Let's then go ahead and implement here the reducing logic for the login action. We are applying here the exact same logic as before. So let's then go ahead and try out this new version of the application. Let's remind ourselves the main difference is the way that we are including the reducers in our application. We are using now store module for feature, and we are linking our authentication reducer directly to the authentication module and not to the root module. Let's then go ahead and switch to a larger window and see how this new version of the application works. We're going to refresh the application, and we are going to notice that besides the initial store action that we had before, we also have here a new action. This action is dispatched whenever one of our feature modules, such as the authentication module, gets registered. Let's go ahead and switch to the login screen and trigger the login action. So as we can see, the same logic is working as before. We have the login flag set to true, and we have the user profile available in the store. So as you can see, the NgGenerate reducer schematic helped us to implement this reducer by scaffolding much of the code that we would have otherwise have to write by hand. And it gives us a nice structure for starting to implement our feature reducer module, and it also automatically registers here our module using for feature, which is much better than defining the reducers here in our root reducer module. One of the main advantages of registering our module using for feature is that it makes it really simple for our module to be lazy loaded if needed. And with this we have completed the implementation of the login action, and at this point in the course we should have a good idea of how actions and reducers work. Let's test our understanding of how actions and reducers work by implementing a new action, the logout action.